So welcome along. The lights are a bit glary. I guess there's right at the very front. I know Ed, you know John quite well. There's an acknowledgement here for John's work, especially with us in the meat industry in getting our listeria program up and running. I still speak with him probably on a weekly basis. I've also got a thanks to Yola and Gina for roping me in. Probably the only dairy experience I've had was as an auditor for Woolies and Coles systems for several in this state and a couple interstate. But there's a lot of similarities in the environments, and when we first received the guidelines, it was this has come from the dairy industry, so I thought, well, how good are they? But I don't know that they've continued at that same pace, certainly not in this state as far as, and I guess they're hamstrung a bit with legislation and what they can do and when they can do it. But certainly, if it were me, I would be adopting a very similar set of guidelines which are in your notes and saying for those that take that on board, perhaps we'll have 2 audits a year. For those that don't want to, we might have 4, and gradually sort of bluff your way through if you can't get the correct legislation. But unfortunately, we had a bit of a blight there, and that was before my time. There were 3 deaths attributed to listeria in, I think it was a corned beef style product, and they were, dare I say it, not in a good state to start with, but that's no excuse, but they were certainly in that Yopi category, being probably 75 plus and immunocompromised as well. So out of today, and not only from my comments, some reinforcement of the vagaries of listeria, and I guess some comfort in our findings over the last 8 years, that although we're somewhat paranoid about every time I leave a place, it hasn't seemed to have manifested itself as we perhaps first thought. And I can go into some more detail about our own testing programs just to show you that. So back in 2008, when I first joined this department, the national guidelines were implemented, and it's been 8 years until I've decided to have another review with minimal change. So I think that's got to tell you that they got it pretty right to start with. I guess the major change was, and no doubt it would have been from pressure from the likes of Primo and those where if there was a positive, you used to have to wait at least a week, sometimes more, between the test and hold clearance program. So if you were looking at a Primo, for example, at Chalora, I don't know how many hundreds of tonnes they'd push out in that week. Now they're looking at a batch, so 24 hours, test again, 24 hours, test again, and they're clear to go. So I've got no concerns with that, because if you are implementing your proper cleaning programs between batches, there's not much more you can do. I guess this is more for the dairy authority's benefit, just to work you through what we were faced with and what we thought was a good idea at the time, and this is where John Sumner came in quite handy. We had a whole host of premises out there. Some were fantastic, and others which were just retail butcher shops that you can see it on the corner of most streets. They were being looked at by the Department of Health, And then when this came on board, they said, you have them. And unfortunately, what they were passing, shit, you know, what do we do with these? So we've had to gradually nurse them along. And out of 200 of those which were cookers, so most of those were wanting to either vacuum pack or at least modify atmosphere pack. So we look like we're going to have quite a few places to be managing, but in the end we finished up with around about 25, and that number's remained constant for the last 8 years. So probably only 10% of those with the potential to pack have opted to take on this standard. When I first started, there was this statement floating around, not the palace but the process. And it does sound good, and with a good HACCP plan you think, well, that's fine. But when you start to talk about listeria and you've got a building that's 40 years old or poorly designed, it's not much help to you. So what John did with our help was implement what we called a gold standard. So each of us auditors went around to those that signed up to say, yes, I want to be part of this group, and there was, I don't know, 50 or so to start with, and marked them on, or scored them on various things like hazard management, which, I mean, the HACCP plan in those days was fairly poor. Factory layout and their clean down and verification of the clean down. So 3 areas, and we made it quite easy. It all totaled up to 100, and they were marked accordingly. But at the end of that initial assessment, we had no passes. So nobody, and a pass was 51%. So that gives you some idea of where they were. So after that bit of a re-evaluation and a second try, we've finished up with 25, which we've still got. Some have gone and some have come on, but that number is still the same.
Could you clarify, so if they don't sign up, they can't make that type of product?
They can make it, they can't pack it. Yeah, yes.
They can't do that.
They can't vacuum pack it or modified atmosphere.
So that long shelf life is eliminated.
That's correct, yeah. And unfortunately, we had to take, I would say half of those were your little butcher shop, and we've taken them on board with a little bit of trouble, but they haven't proven to be, as I said before, that hasn't manifested in major problems. But from that initial takeover period, anybody putting their hand up now to be part of the listeria program, they've got to have a premise that suits, so complete segregation and everything that goes with it. And I think if you tell them the hard truth at day one, it's a lot easier for everybody. And I'm sure that the rest of industry wants us to keep that line of thought. So yes, we had a quick look at what sort of process control they were currently undertaking. We were looking at certainly the 65 for 10, no matter what style of product. Now I've got the wrong acronym there for what used to be AQUIS. I think it's DAWR now. But with the huge amount of pork being imported, and I won't quote what Chalora uses, but I know AQUIS set up this time temperature profile, and this was for their plastic, for the cardboard, just to keep a wasting disease out of our country, which is fine, but it wasn't a 6D thermal process at the bottom end of the scale, so that caused us a few problems early on. Other things, was the verification suitable? And again, what Yola and others have spoken about, corrective actions, did they work? you know, a lot of this that I'm going to speak on, or I am speaking on, we have covered briefly with the previous speakers. So I would like a lot more questions than we've had so far, but nothing from the previous speakers. Factory layout and operation, you've seen it already, but things like a one-way flow, good segregation. I learnt initially about the zoning in the Nestle factory in Melbourne. That was a very well run place. But just at the time of the audit, they'd only had listeria 3 times in about 20 years, which was amazing. And the last time was because one of the employees dragged a wheelie bin inside to take the rubbish instead of taking the rubbish out to it. So it was as simple as that. Pack area separation, yeah, we've allowed segregation or separation by time with some of the smaller plants, that it's just not possible to have a separate packing room, separate something else when they've only got a whole shop this size. So they'll say every Tuesday morning we'll pack off before we start work, and we're happy with that. Your staff movement, you've spoken about. Decontamination or anti-rooms. Unfortunately, the best place is closed down. Aldinga Turkeys here in Adelaide had a fantastic design with their anti-room, where staff would come in and they were just restricted to that particular area anyway, but they would sit on a seat, swing over, change their boots and do everything that you'd see in a classic operation. Yeah, the protective clothing, how that's worn. Do you go to the toilet in your overalls, or what do you do? There's a lot to think about. Or just hang on until 10 o'clock or whatever. The design of equipment, can it be efficiently cleaned? That again, there's been a lot of focus on slicing or slices today. That has proven to be an issue, but only because it's in what we call Zone 1, it actually touches the product. There's a lot of other equipment that also was proven difficult. I was happy to hear Ed's talk on the efficacy of sanitisers. I think that's overlooked. You know, it's like a magic bullet, the same as a pair of gloves or a freezer. They all think it's something that's going to save the world. So that's something I'll be taking back with me today, just to keep an eye on the various sanitisers in use. The cracks in floors, again with Ed's talk about this company in Ireland. I know I've read it somewhere, but the same listeria poked its head out of a crack in the floor after, I thought it was 14 years, but it might have only been 10. That shows you the enemy that you're up against. Wet areas, we've spoken about those, as well as aerosols. Something that we didn't talk much about in the early days were these biofilms. And if your little girl that gave us that great sentence on what was that first one that she described in your talk? If you can get her to give me one sentence on what a biofilm is, I'd be happy to hear it. It's just so complicated, those biofilms, and I think there's not a great understanding anywhere about them yet. But if you just think that they are almost like a slime and you need to get in with some elbow grease rather than stand back and think it's going to happen. And that was one of the big problems with this last sprout outbreak that we had. There were a huge amount of biofilms everywhere you looked. And that only ever, well, I can't say too much, but the cleaning program was pretty much just cold water. So the last part of the gold standard was their clean down program. Did they have a documented program in all areas, covering all types of equipment, frequency? The training, that's been really emphasised today, which has been fantastic. Unfortunately, the Food Standards Code really only talks about a training level commensurate with the job you're doing, which is a bit argy-bargy. And we're probably the worst offenders. You can be cutting hair one day and then making sausages the next, and we can't stop you. We can as you get a little bit higher up into the manufacture of UCFM, but apart from that, we're struggling a bit with trying to enforce some level of education and skills and knowledge. Choice and management of chemicals, focus on drains, so you can see all the information is there and has been for quite some time, and it hasn't changed a lot. Monitoring, swabbing. Now this was prior to the release of the guidelines, so there wasn't much of that at all, and corrective action overall. And we found the best results in cleaning were, and still do, with low pressure, chlorinated alkalis, followed by rinsing and sanitising with a quat, but depending on the size of the place and the money spent, it could be a ring main or just a bucket and brush. So after all that was done, we did promise to revisit the gold standard every couple of years, but as happens, we're too busy. We've done 2 micro surveys, which I'll talk to you about, but just getting the time to come back and revisit these places has proven a bit difficult. But I'm sure even in this state, your dairy processing plants, there'd be some parallels. You'd have the high performers and the middle of the roads, and then a few that need quite a bit of work. Now these guidelines, which are attached, and they make fantastic reading, and I urge you all to read them more than once. My only concern with them, and I made it known when we had the chance to comment this year, but it fell on deaf ears. There's quite a bit of should terminology in there, so you should do this and you should do that. Well, the people that you want to do, they go, oh, well, it only says should, I'm not going to worry. They talk about a minimum number of swabs to be taken, so take 5 samples, and that's what you're going to get, 5, even if the place is 3 times as big as this auditorium, unless they are got a good QA manager like Madam Lash up there. They may do some more, or they may succumb to supermarket pressure and these third-party audits to do more. There's still some degree of thought towards end product testing as the be-all and end-all, but it's not, and I was glad to hear that certainly in Ed's talk that let's try and do as much environmental sampling as we can, not get to that stage. So overall, the guidelines have really got 2 fundamental keystones or principles. The design of the environmental plan, in other words, your capacity to search and to find, and your response when you do find. And it's still very difficult for people to put their hand up and say, I've found it. Even in the guidelines, it says give them a gold star, but they still don't want to. They still want to say we've got it. So where we can, we encourage a really aggressive search and detection. And you'll also find that there's several pages of difficult reading on what to do when you do find listeria. One good thing in all of it, I guess, pretty much without exception, wherever there's listeria species detected, our people have taken it on board as it being mono. So I'd like to keep it that way rather than duck and dive and say it's its half brother or something. not the way to go. So since that time, touch wood, we've had no foodborne illnesses attributed to El Mono in meat products manufactured in our state. We've had an average of less than 10 environmental positives. So that's not a lot. That's per year, but it's still, you know, when you look at the thousands of swabs that have been taken, I've worked it out to be 1 in 300. And then in product, 2 in 300, averaging 1 recall a year. So we're probably looking at 8 or 9 recalls over that time. But just in this last 3 to 4 months, we've had 3 in product. So there's really no rhyme or reason as to why. Luckily, they were all found through the company's testing. I think quite an interesting fact with this, and it shows you, I guess, where the strengths and weaknesses are with the implementation of the guidelines. In 2011 and 2013, we did a comprehensive survey on all these 25, and we were horrified to find Listeria species in 50%, and 2 years later in 65% of all premises. So you would think, well, what's going on? You know, why do you find it and they don't? Well, I guess the reasons include this should use this or should use that. You've got the choice of the swab or the little cotton bud, so they all go for the cheap cotton bud. Bit of a corner there and send it in. Whereas when we came out, we all used the sponge, and we certainly aggressively searched for it and found it. But again, it still hasn't shown up in those sort of numbers. So why that is still a little bit beyond us, but the sampling by staff out there, you've still got to wonder about the independence of the sample and how they actually do it. I'd like to think they wouldn't try and be silly about it and, you know, stick their samples in the microwave or whatever, but sometimes you wonder. We've got places out there that have been testing for 8 years and never found it, yet we've found it in the 2 times that we've been there. We allow those rapid swabs to be used. Sometimes their own methods may not be as good as they should be, but they still have to once a year have a comparative sample sent to the lab, but it's still them taking the swab. So unless someone from the lab came and took it, it still hasn't got that level of independence that I'd like. And as I said here, the area, you know, we can cover 10 times the area with 1 swab, and we were taking 10 samples each time. So what I've done is developed a protocol for each of the companies, just listing what they produce, how often they produce it, how much they produce, who they sell to, having a close look at their HACCP plan, their recall plan, and it's a bit of quite a detailed, more than an audit. Unfortunately, the people that audit for the meat hygiene unit are restricted in time. I know they shouldn't be, but you know, sometimes they can go to a butcher shop and only spend an hour twice a year, and in that time, you know, they have to look at 50 things apart from the program for Listeria. So it is a bit of a tough ask, and that's why I do an extra one. I've also been to each of the other states, been a guest over there, to, I call it a cross review, but just have a look at what they do and what they, the way they do it. Even though you think it's national guidelines, there should be no need for calibration, but we've found that with some of our interstate colleagues, their punchlines are, we expect them to do blah, blah, blah. Well, whether they are or not, I don't know. We don't recognise third party for the high risk operations such as UCFM and the Listeria program. So if you're getting audited by someone on behalf of Coles, Woolies, Audi, or even in this case Aquis, we still go in there. We've just found that their focus is probably not where it should be. They rather count the amount of shifting spanners than cracks in the girls' toilet and things like that, even though I have been one of them in a past life. Yeah, I've spoken about this year 3 positives. Now, in getting a reason, I've certainly got a reason for 2 out of the 3, and it's again comes back to the level of awareness or the level of training. You'd like to think that if there were 10 people working in the plant and they saw something dropped on the floor and you went to pick it up, they'd crack you. But in this case, one company had 10 leg hams to be cut into thirds. That's the only order they had. So the bloke thought, well, I'm not going to use my saw, I'll go out into the butcher shop. Theirs is already dirty, so I'll use that. So that's what they did. And then it came back positive. And in the other one, Katrina, I've just remembered what it was. It was like a pork roll with a crackle, and they couldn't cut it with a knife. Whether that was just for that particular sample, so they did use a saw and picked it up there. So that was 2 out of the 3. And in the first one, I went out there and did 10 swabs of my own after this chap had done 2 lots of 5 straight, nothing. I did 10, found Listeria mono on the inside of the door, the chiller door, and the outside of the chiller door, and a Listeria species in a filler, because this was a pudding. It's a different type of product. So he went back and had to do 3 more. Again, he found nothing. So yeah, you wonder.
Do you think they're just not doing the swabs right, or they're just...
I think it's just a little bit of a light touch here and one there. He wants 5, there's 5, send them off. My very first, and I can say it now because the factory's shut, but I was an Aquis inspector at Chapman's, a big pig killing place in the hills, and my first job as an auditor was to go back to Chapman's. So unfortunately I knew all the back doors, but I went in there and I said to the 2 girls doing the QA, I'll watch you when you do your swabs. So the first one to walk around with the sanitizer, and the second one to come in, swab. We haven't had, I don't know what you're looking at, we haven't had trouble here for 20 years. And then I went into they were cooking frits. And there was this big bikie there, he must have hurt his shoulder, so they put him down into just cooking the frits. And he was just pulling it out, and I said, oh, I need to take it, or you need to take a temperature and show me that you've reached 65. No, he didn't say 65, just take a temperature. So he had an old clock face thermometer. Yeah, the old tell true. Jammed it in, it was about 49. And he looked at me. And he said, well, what do you want it to be? And I said, it's got to be 65. So he pulled it out, tap it, 61, 66. Right, good. and it must have been either his half-brother or a van came back, and they always used to take back more than they'd sell, and he'd get the packs. So he was like the QA on the returns. They did improve, but okay. So the learnings over those 8 years, there's certainly a raised awareness and improved knowledge on what listeria is and how to combat it. We're still struggling a little bit with the guidelines and their definition, which straight comes from FSANZ, on what constitutes a ready-to-eat product. We hadn't in the past included anything fermented or jerky, for example, any dried products, because we were of the formed opinion that the pH and water activity would have done the job, but that's not the way it's interpreted by everybody else, so we may well have to change that. I'd like to see a test and hold program implemented for everybody. I know it's not always possible, and I'd hate to think that we'll put another 2 weeks' life on so we can entertain that, but we've found so many that it's come back positive, and well, not so many, some, and they've already sent the stuff out. Whereas if they could have kept it for a couple of days, we could have just had a trade withdrawal without the hysteria around the rest of it. At this stage in South Australia, we haven't got a company capable of changing the product in formulation, so it won't support the growth of listeria. Certainly the likes of Primo and others, they've done it for the last 10 or 15 years. To be able to, I guess, qualify for that program, you've got to demonstrate consistency over 5 batches. So you've got to be able to prove that pH is the same and your nitrite level's the same, your salt's the same, and unfortunately nobody can do it in this state. They're all still a little bit artisan or whatever you want to call them. But it will come with the bigger players. And I think part of that is due to, dare I say it, is not being recorded, is it? Supermarket pressure for the shelf life. And you start to eat something that you can, taste like vinegar and lemon juice or whatever, but it still does deliver a safe product where the listeria, if it happens to get in there, will not grow, and come recall time, if it's less than 100, they're home and hosed. Coles had an instance here Christmas Eve. That's worse than a Friday, but about 3 years ago, where listeria was detected in a product, and they were able to use a scientist to prove that it would not support the growth. So as it was less than 100, there was no recall involved, so that would have saved Coles plenty, or the company I should say. Just a couple of little points down the bottom. America sets swabs per square feet, so they must say, okay, this place is this big, we've got to have X amount of swabs. We haven't looked at that, whether we should or not, I don't know, but it's something to think about. They use, and so do some places in Victoria now, heat as a sanitizer. So they'll throw a big, they'll envelop a machine and pump some steam into it, or do that in the cool rooms, and that's proved very, very good against listeria. The crunchy quat, I saw that in the Nestle factory, where rather than coming into what should be a dry area with 2 gallons of water running off your boots, you walk through some crunchy quat and the area remains remarkably dry. So all we're doing at the moment, I'll do the extra audit. We don't allow slicing in some factories where we believe there's a risk. That's certainly the case for the company that was the cause of the issue to start with. We do reduce shelf life. A lot of the ones that, or the new ones that come on, that's a condition of them coming into the system until we're quite happy that they're good at what they do. The use of offsets, so not in formulation, but they may well dip in an acetic acid. And as I said before, much tougher on the new entrants as far as construction goes, and that's the line you people need to take if you're going to have any chance of getting things right. So I think that's probably about it. Now, as I said before, I'm open to as many questions as you like. I've got, 60 seconds before lunch.